Go.
Hello and welcome to Writer Mother Monster. I'm your host, Laura Ehrlich, and our guest tonight is Hilda Raz. Before I introduce Hilda, thank you all for tuning in, and please chat with us during the interview. Your comments will appear in our broadcast studio, and we'll weave them into our conversation. And as always, if you enjoy this episode, please consider becoming a patron or patroness to help me keep this podcast going. It is a one-woman show, and I need all the help I can get. If you go to writermothermonster.com, you'll find the support tab, and there are multiple ways to support. Now, I'm excited to introduce Hilda at last. We've had a few postponements, and I'm just thrilled to have her here tonight, finally with us. Hilda Raz has been a director, award judge, and contributor in this country's most prestigious poetry journals and contests. She was editor of the literary journal Prairie Schooner and served as president of the Association of Writers and Writing Programs. Hilda's many poetry collections include What Happens, All Odd and Splendid, Trans, and Divine Honors, among others. She lives in New Mexico, where she works as the series editor for poetry at the University of New Mexico Press. She has 2 children in their 50s and describes writer motherhood in 3 words as flexible, brave, and collaborative. Now, please join me in welcoming Hilda. Hi, Hilda.
Hey, Laura. Good to see you.
Oh, it's so great to have you here. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for asking me.
Yeah, so let's start with those 3 words, as we usually do here on Writer Mother Monster. Tell us about flexible, brave, collaborative.
Okay. All right. So most of us do. I just quickly wrote down what and those are the words: flexible, brave, and collaborative. But I meant them literally. That is, I was 23 when I got pregnant with my first child, and I had never itched a baby. I had known a baby. I was the youngest of the cousins. My mother had many sisters, and I was raised in a clutch of cousins. So I got pregnant, and I loved being pregnant. I mean, I had the usual, but I was embodied. You know, people began to look at me. I was in Boston on the T. People would pat my belly, and I was a kind of girl. I got bigger and bigger. I had a 9-pound baby. So during my pregnancy, I found everything interesting. But I also developed this, that my skin, nicely, I was very young, over this increasingly large bulge in my family that my body was doing. It was stretching. It was sufficiently flexible. This was the nature of humankind. And the child I would have was literally part of me. So I loved birth. You know, what a drama. And it was, Grantley Dick Reed in natural childbirth. I studied, I'm diligent, et cetera, et cetera. Everyone paid lots of attention to me because, and in those days, Papa, God knows where Papa was. He certainly wasn't there. But after birth, I recovered pretty well, and I was in the hospital for a week, and the nurses brought my 9-pound baby John. I watched him being born. I liked him pretty well. And nurses helped me, and nursing seemed to go well. And then the 7th day, the nurse brought him in, and Fred had gone to get the car, and she said, "Here's your son." And I said, "Am I supposed to take him?" That's a description. That's a literal description of my feelings. And John, most first babies big, have colic, and John had colic, and he screamed, and nothing I could do would help that. And so at that time I was in analysis, you know, I was so at the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute, and my analyst was a young man, Dr. Feynman. He had, I don't even think he was married. He didn't, and he never said anything. But about when John was about 3 months old, Fred brought John in his, we didn't have any money. He from the grocery store with padding, and he brought John to pick me up. And I got in the car and I looked at John. He wasn't crying, and I picked him up. He looked at me and he began to nuzzle, and I fell in love with him. I know about love at first sight. Not that happened 3 months too, and thereafter followed what happens, and your many guests have talked about what happens. So being flexible for me, that my skin, my body was strong. It could enclose my family, and I could feed it, my family. And that leads us to the next word, which is brave, because, you know, that isn't the way it goes exactly. The kids have own, and if you're flexible, you kind of follow them around and pay attention to who they are. They aren't really paying a lot. They don't really care who you are exactly, but they will teach you. You know, they'll, if you follow them, they'll tell you where they want to go, and if you go, they like it. Or, and if you're brave, you learn how to handle yourself to get through the traumas. And there are traumas. There were traumas. And then the collaborative stuff is, all of this is applicable to my professional life as well. So I collaborated with my children to get them grown. They led and I followed. And I kept them as safe as I could. I liked them. They were interested, and they were interested in things I wasn't interested in, so that I became interested because I could read better than they could. So that those were the words that I thought of, and that's the way I think they apply to my professional life as well.
I love that. I had never thought about that definition of flexible and the skin covering your child and enclosing them. That's really beautiful and poetic, which is appropriate.
But for me, it was literal. And, yes. And I had to learn. The collaborative part helped me to learn to separate from them, because you know, if you want to work.
Yeah, and so actually that leads us right before our interview. You were telling me when you were just getting started, there were no women professors. There, you were right there. You paved the way for future generations. So can you tell us about what it was like early on as a writer, and then we'll weave in the motherhood.
Sure. Well, let me just say that I was at BU. And I studied with Robert Lowell. I had the great good fortune to be accepted into his seminar. And that was at the time that he was writing Life Studies, which is the poetry book that really changed. Had been a formal blah, blah, blah. Anyway, his life. I contend and believe this, that both Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton had studied in the same seminar I was in some years later, not many years later, actually. And I believe that he took from their work the vigor and of connecting a human life, your human, with your poems. And so I heard Anne Sexton's first poetry reading in the library of the BU English department. And Lowell blew her from the far way back. I think he said something like, poems from a woman poet or something, you know, I should have looked it up, but I didn't. So I was there. Adrienne Rich was very prominent with formal and disguised book of the mother-in-law. I think that I don't remember the name of it, but she was across the river, and Elizabeth Bishop teaching in the basement. A lot happened. A lot happened in those years to young women who were being heard for the first time. And we became a kind of collaborative, women's collaborative with and for each other. And so that's where I was. At the same time, I was working at Planned Parenthood. I was the assistant director of the Planned Parenthood League of Massachusetts during the time of the Blue Laws. So I was, okay, so laws meant it was the law to use contraceptive. It was also against the law to prescribe contraceptives. So, who was the executive director of Planned Parenthood at the time, had this wonderful, John Rock was working on the birth pill, and she thought, well, what if we collaborate with him and open clinics in the hospitals? And the director of, or the treasurer of Planned Parenthood, which meant that she would and write a check for the entire year's budget, but she was president of the board. And so this is just the sort of matrix, the context of my life as a poet, as an activist, and as a person who was growing aware of the dearth of voices in my life. At the same time I was writing, I mean, I was in seminar. Was I a woman in that? I think so. Certainly his favorites were 3 male poets who have done well. So, I can't hear you.
Rookie mistake. Yeah, we'll braid in motherhood in a moment. Hilda, let's see really quickly if you have anything else using your internet at the moment. Let's see if we can turn it off. We're getting a little bit of glitching here.
Okay.
And that's okay.
I have things open, yeah. Oh, I just lost you. Let me close this.
Bear with us, everyone. We'll get Hilda back in a second and she'll rejoin us. I know there have been a little bit of some connectivity issues, but while we're waiting for her to rejoin us, oh, thank you so much, Sarah. Sarah K says, some glitches, but interesting to hear you. And Hilda, thank you for doing this, of course. Yes, Hilda's such a legend. She's rejoining us in just a moment, but while she is, I'm going to plug her book. This one is her new book, Letters from a Place I've Never Been, and it's an anthology of Hilda's work. Here she is, rejoined us. Hilda, I'm just plugging your book while we were waiting for you to come back to join us. Hilda's new collection out here from Nebraska Press, right, Hilda? Yes. So let's see if that's a little bit better here. And I think...
Is that better?
Yes, that seems better.
Okay.
Great. Okay, and we even had a little break to hopefully push some sales for your book, so that worked out well.
It's not an anthology, it's new and collected poems.
Great.
Kwame Dawes came to me and asked if I'd be interested. And I said, are you kidding? I had just had a book, this book called Listen and Story, come out just the year before in 2020. And um, he arranged it and made it all happen. And then John Kinsella, who is an Australian resident, who had followed my work for many years, and he wrote the introduction, the critical introduction to the book. So it has poems that have never been collected in my books. It has all the books of poems and new poems that are from the last year, and then poems from the earlier years that had been published in journals but had never been collected in books. So I'm grateful for it, and it's a beautiful book, and thanks to the University of Nebraska Press for taking it on.
It is a beautiful book. Yeah, I used the wrong word, anthology collection, but I have read it. And if you guys have not read this book, please do. It is beautiful. And it is fascinating to see, as you said, sort of some of the earliest poems all the way to your more recent works, and some of the narrative threads that have pulled through all of those years of work. So actually, this might be a good time. Would you like to read us a poem?
Oh, okay, sure.
Your choice.
All right. Well, I was thinking, my poems have gotten more ironic and distanced, but I really would like to read the second poem in my first book. This was my first book.
I'm going to isolate you so that it's just you on the screen. Here we go.
Okay. All right. So these are all reprinted. But this is called Atonement. This is the second poem in my first book. Dear God of silence for women, God absent from bath and laundry room, God whose clotheslines on rainy days never droop wet linen, look on this flesh, this heavy head, and take pity on those of us who neither rejoice in the burn unit for another day's suffering, nor insist on our worthiness in the halls of power. What do we know who wrap our wet hair in towel turbans? Bless a daughter in the distant academy who stains her tissue samples with toluidine blue O, watching under her microscope the group tissues turn magenta. And bless the daughters who hunger not for food, but only to subdue their bodies. Forgive us the great sins of our fathers and of our flesh and wanting knowledge, for which we are punished by a ceasing of hunger, and for the greater sins of the heart that lead us away from familiar men. Let us be free of them, except sons and lovers and those who write well. And then the poem goes on, but those stanzas speak most directly to the condition of women as I felt myself to be at that time. Unheard, unconsidered, even positing a God who was different from me because his clotheslines never drooped with wet linen. I saw myself as part of an unheard majority. And at the same time, I was having children and working and writing, and doing critical writing as well, reading Adrienne Rich about motherhood and.
Yeah. How did you feel, or did you feel, that writing was a way to give voice, to sort of bring yourself out in front of people who weren't seeing you as a woman during that time?
Well, I've listened to so many women on your show talk about writing. I'd never thought of writing as part of me, as my identity. But I wrote from the time I was a small child. And I was trying to figure out how to show you. I can show you these are two very early, whoops, no, steno pads. You see, that's what I chose, steno pads. And I began to write my, I began to write the work that's in my collected poems when I was in labor with John. And I thought I could put my hand on the notebook and read you the page. It starts 6 centimeters dilated. And it goes on through the birth, and which I wrote the next day. And then it began. And so there are descriptions of the children. I wrote all the time while I was caring for them, while they were engaged in other things, or with one hand I'd be playing with, you know. So, sorry, the phone is.
No, that's okay.
So what then happened to me was that I began to find mentors. Robert Lowell was my first, and he paid attention to my poems. At least he was a very brilliant, he was a genius, but he was also a brilliant teacher. And he would bring the poems in life studies to class as he was writing them. And so I had that witnessed. And then there was the Planned Parenthood years where Hazel Segal, who was a great businesswoman and working for a nonprofit, as radically predisposed as I was, working with a group of very wealthy women to make possible birth control in a place where it was, a time when it was illegal, making possible by collaborating with each other and with doctors. And then I moved to Nebraska. I left, and I grown up. I mean, it's probably yours. Then I was in Nebraska, and I had a 9-month-old baby, John, and I was lucky enough to, because of my background in literature, not in social work, to be connected with Bernice Sloat, who was editing Prairie Schooner. I'm leaving out some mentors in there who were men. But Bernice Sloat and Breadloaf, Writers' Conference in Vermont. Can you still hear me? Can you still hear me? Okay.
I can hear you.
So there I met Robert Pack, who was the director of the Breadloaf Writers' Conference. And he liked my work. And I met Breadloaf, and I can possibly name, and won't, it's not my name, famous name, but with young women. Someone organized us to a meeting in the Blue Boiler. It was packed with women. And the subject was, how the hell can we get our writing done and be pregnant and deliver babies? And how are we going to do this impossible thing? And very famous writers were there. We were all young and women and befuddled. Now, I can't say this is how many years later, 50, 40 years later. I can't see from your news that a lot has changed. One of you was talking veil that's put over pregnancy, and a very successful woman, but pregnant, mourning, afflicted, and finding anything. Well, that for being at Breadloaf, of others who was asking the same questions. But anyway, so I had a lot of help from Bernie Sloat, who gave me the opportunity at Prairie Schooner to do anything I wanted to do. And I had on the masthead every position there was, from editorial assistant to poetry editor. And then I finally became editor and had, I don't know, 30 years, decades at the helm of Prairie Schooner, which was wonderful for me. And I did a lot of good work, a lot of special issues that were done. But the best thing was that I was then able to be mentor and be mentored by my PhD students. And those women have done magnificently well. And men. There were, yes. So, and there were many, not many more. There were some more women. And they mentored me and I mentored them, and we were collaborative, and we each one helped one. Great. And so I stayed. Now Kwame Dawes, who is a brilliant and distinguished African American man who started an African Book Award through Prairie Schooner, which is bringing African writers to American audiences and giving them prizes and publishing them. But I started a book series in 2 genres. The magazine is now endowed because of the philanthropy of Glenna Lushai, another woman writer I met when she was very young. I was the 5th editor of Prairie Schooner, and almost 100 years of continuous publication. So I was able to use my platform and my presence as a gatekeeper to change the table of contents from, maybe, I used to have these statistics in my brain, I don't know, maybe 8% of the tables of contents to 50% and more. And we all know about anthologies that lead the way. The anthologies had the same table of contents, the same men, and the 10% were different women every single year. I changed some of that in collaboration with other women editors and writers. We made a big difference. I hope that difference continues. I have to interview you to find out if it does. But you have a brilliant book from Red End Press. And I was just going to show you this. I don't know if you've asked Kate Gale to be on your program, but this is her new book in my series, the Mary Burritt Christensen, named after a woman, endowed series at the University of New Mexico Press. This is Kate's new book. You can see from the cover that Medusa is
some monstrous woman right there, right?
Right. And the history of monster. So yeah, it continues. We're still bringing more women writers and men. I have 2 sons, so I have a big stretch, big flexible skin to enclose.
Absolutely. Now, this is probably an obvious question for people watching this show, but I think it's an important question. What would you say to people who whose response to the need to expand that table of contents and to draw in new voices and women's voices and diverse voices is, well, they aren't out there, so that's why they're not in my collection or my magazine?
I don't have to speak to them. I don't have to speak to that argument, because contemporary culture demonstrates the lie. That is a lie. That's a lie. And the voices are profound and important and humanizing. And we need to speak through those voices, and we need to read them, and we need to teach them, and we need to search for them. And
nope, I think that's perfect. And I love the last thing that you said, we need to search for them. I feel like often there's a laziness where if something is not in your immediate sphere of attention or influence. It just doesn't exist. But you're right. You need to
actively.
We
live in an international culture, or cultures. We learned that from third wave feminism. Second wave feminism said women are not heard. Third wave feminism is more subtle and understands that there are many feminisms, there are many voices, and we need to not only listen to them, we need to look for them. You're doing that. You're doing that. I'm doing that. I hope that some of the people who have signed on are doing it as well. I know that I just had some poems in this marvelous journal, Plowshares. Can you see it? Plowshares is the current. That Randolph is the editor of Plowshares, which is one of the most influential journals in the world. And she is carrying that tradition in her own way forward, as you are, Lara. That's just the truth of it. You are. We all are.
Thank you, Hilda. We are. And all of you who are listening are. If you're a listener of Writer Mother Monster, you're part of this community moving our voices forward. So thank you all for listening and being here. Yeah. Hilda, tell me, let's switch gears a little bit. I want to hear about your children. Now I know you you don't tell their stories, but tell me about them from your perspective, from the parent angle.
Okay. Let me just say, I mentioned John. John Link, the composer, is my older son. And he is famous and a scholar and has, as well as a composer, has a book coming very soon from Cambridge University Press on the composer Elliott Carter. He's a Carter scholar and a teacher. And he's the father of two daughters, Anna and Ava. And actually, this morning, Ava and I spent probably an hour on FaceTime talking. Ava is living in Spain. She's in Valencia, where she's teaching. She's on her junior year at Oxford, abroad. And Anna is moving to Berlin, an international family. And Papa, as they call him, Papa is a great Papa. He is a great father in a new tradition. And he is woke, as they would say, raising daughters, and understands the need and has some power to hire women composers and see that their work is played. He collaborates with women as well as men. So that's John, older son John. He's a wonderful son. When your children grow up, if you're very, very lucky, they are your friends, and you collaborate with them sometimes by asking them to read your work and offering to proofread some parts of their books. So that's John. And my younger son is Aaron Raslink, whose name you may know. He is the author of, let me find it, this book, which is called What Becomes You. And it is a memoir in the Tobias Wolff edited live series from the University of Nebraska. The book is in two parts, Aaron's part, and the second part is my part. Aaron was born Sarah, and I know Aaron was born Sarah because I was there, and I saw her, and I raised her. And so here I am, a feminist, activist, writer, editor, professor, / everything else. And I know everything I've learned with difficulty for many years. And Aaron, Sarah, writes me a letter and tells me that he's changed his name to Aaron. He has been on testosterone therapy for a year. And he is very shortly going to have surgery to make congruent his body with his gender identity. And he loves me very much. And he understands that I may choose not to participate or in his life going forward. He understands that. He recognizes that that is my right. And he's telling me this news. So, you know, John had heart surgery when he was 6. Aaron almost died from a blood clot. And there are lots of other stories about that motherhood brings you. But I will, you know, epistemology, how we know what we know, how, you know, this develops slowly throughout your whole life. How do you know what you know? That news from my child, you know, my skin enclosed my child. I don't have the language. I had to write a book with Aaron to describe my reaction to this. Aaron is very articulate and smart and interested. He's by nature a scientist and a person interested in theater, and he was a jeweler for many years. He made me these earrings. These were a recent present. He's talented in many different ways. He graduated from clown school. He's just a talented person in many different directions. So he had lots of things, and I took seriously that you know, this is a great metaphor. We are animals. Animals leave babies, grow up, and at some point they walk off. And I thought about that. I thought about that. But Aaron, who was very patient, incredibly patient, way more patient than I would have suspected any human being could be with such adult as I was, explained things to me so at least I could get a glimmering. And I understood that Aaron was as he had always been. This is the child I gave birth. This is the child I raised. And I remembered that we lived in London for a year, and on the tube, Sarah peeled off her little corduroy dress, you know, with the blue flowers, and she took off her tights, she took off her shoes, and she never ever would wear a dress again, or tights, or Mary Jane shoes, or any of that. I mean, I should have known this, but you know what, Laura? Nobody knew this was possible. We know now that there had been transsexuals through history, you know, from the Garden of Eden. But Aaron was one of the first. He didn't know. He did not know until he was 30 years old. Wow. And I can't tell that story. He would have to tell that story. But I came to understand that this person I was seeing in front of me had been the same person in some essential, you know, essentialism, that's not a good word these days. You know, nothing is essentially so, but that his skin enclosed the same person I had given birth to. And so we're both writers, and one of us thought maybe we should write a book about this. Yeah. And it took us a long time to figure out how could we do it? Because we kept trying to write in the same voice, but our voices are very different. Yeah. So this is now many years later, decades later, and we're still very close friends.
So this is one discovery that you made about your children, and that your children helped you make about yourself. How did those types of discoveries find their way into your writing, whether in the craft or the form or the language?
I believe that writers, I was trained as a scholar in the new criticism. That is, the body and the life are separate from the body of work, and the work is a body. It is the work embodied. It's not the writer embodied. And I was trained not to consider the life of T.S. Eliot when I looked at four quartets, where I studied and I wrote critically. But with Lowell, I began to understand with life studies what I had always practiced. That is, I knew a lot about other stuff, but the other stuff was filtering through my consciousness, my genetic structure, my eyes. And my life has always maybe highly coded. You know, all your writers, many of them are novelists, and their narratives are so different from one another. But the women cartoonists you talked, I'm sorry, I don't know their names.
No, that's okay. Yeah.
Was mentioning that she has no idea where the genesis of her strip comes from. You know, a rabbit, a girl rabbit shooting a gun. She has no idea. But if she were an analysis, she could probably trace it back. So I have come to trust that the embodied person I am is leading the work, and I'm following. Now, the formal properties of the work seem to, if I'm writing a book, if I'm writing a poem in tercets or quatrains, or I'm writing a sonnet, or I'm writing a narrative poem or whatever, the material suggests the form. And I'm trained to recognize that, and I write with my ear. So I'm following all that. It's not memoir I'm writing. I'm following the materials. But I have to have been exposed to, either in my dreams or in my imagination, it's filtered through me. So it was a long-winded way of answering your question.
No, I love that answer. And that's a really interesting progression of your perspective on criticism and literary criticism. And I had never thought about a body of work as a physical body. And here we are again to the skin stretching over the life inside of you. That's fascinating. So, yeah. Thank you. And so early on, when you and I were talking before the interview, you showed me your first book, and you might have held it up at some point during our conversation here. But this book, you said, was just, what did you say earlier? Like wet with motherhood, or dripping with motherhood.
Yeah.
Yeah. Could you read us one of your wettest poems from that book?
Oh, I could read, you know, I would be ashamed to read this, but it is,
there's no shame on Writer Mother Monster, Hilda.
Yeah, I'm beginning to get that. Okay, so I wrote this poem. It's called Dishes, out of the fantasy of motherhood and sisterhood that informed my life at this time. There is no irony in it, and it is a dream that came true for a little while in my life, and it speaks to collaboration. It's called Dishes. It's a sort of longish poem, Dishes. It has an epigraph from Antonio Machado, poet I love. And this is the epigraph. Now is always still. Now is always still. For years, I have been doing the dishes. Once, 2 months from giving birth, I stood at the sink with my friend, big with a child, who held blobs, one in each hand. They were shiny, black from the sea, and salty, and would be sweet later in our mouths and itchy to our bare forearms as we sat, one each side of a crockery bowl, cracking shells, pulling meat for the salad. But now they were struggling, and I left off washing to reach out and take them, laughing at their pegged claws and only a little afraid, and watched her lift the deep lid from the steaming kettle. Later, dinner. Music came across the lake through the open windows, and air moved on our wet skins, and we knew small burstings of kernels torn from their cobs and deep ripples behind our denim aprons as the babies who would so soon be daughters rolled and elbowed. And then the dishes. We sat together on high stools at the soapstone sink and washed our hands in pale suds and dried them. The piles of plates grew and were transported away, and then the deep orange enamel pots heavy in our shining hands. And then it was dark. We put up our dripping towels on the wooden dowel racks, and as balanced as we could be on rock steps, lumbered down the steps to the shore. We dropped our flowered cotton clothes where we stood on the grass, and naked walked into a cool water as dark as our futures, where we floated and sank and turned up, calling across a widening surface of silver water, calling, calling, and whispering, sister, sister. So I just, as I was reading that, I realized there's so many images of violence in that poem. You know, the corn kernels torn from the cobs and the lobsters and the violence of they're trying to get away and in our futures. And that was what I was sensing. Beneath this maternal dream of pregnancy was violence.
Do you remember when exactly you wrote that one? Were you pregnant at the time? Was it before you became a mother?
No, but it was that is the literal truth of the experience. I was pregnant with my best friend at the same time, and we were very close, and our families were very close. And this had happened exactly as I had told it. But I don't remember, Laura. I don't remember when I wrote it. I wrote it cherishing the image of maternal camaraderie, collaboration.
Oh, that's lovely.
I embedded in it those images of violence and separation that are the flip side of pregnancy and birth. Separate, the flesh and connections.
Well, you said you'd been writing since you were a child. Did you always want to be a mother?
It never occurred to me that I had a choice. I mean, as I grew up, my power came from sexuality, from my body. That's where my power came. I remember very clearly living as in this, horde of cousins. I remember that very clearly. But my power seemed to come to me at puberty, and it never occurred to me. I've written endlessly about this, the miraculous machinery that we can choose to use or not to use. So I don't have an answer to that. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's a great answer, or a great different direction to take. Can we talk about our sexuality for a second? And Tell me a little bit more about that power through sexuality, and how you used it or didn't use it, and how you saw the other women around you using or not using their sexuality.
Well, I believed with, one of the reasons that I've been successful as an editor, I always say, is because I have weak boundaries. I fall into books or into poem. I don't need to retain the sense of the ego, Hilda. I prefer to shed it. But I understood that the only way I could get ahead was through the power of men. I had a very powerful father and a passive mother. And I had a brother who was very brilliant and clearly destined to be a physicist, destined for greatness. It never occurred to me that I could have any power except through a man. And I was then, when male people began to be interested in me, they were not interested in me because I was Hilda or had anything to offer them, but they thought I would be decorative. I had nice clothes. I modeled when I was young. I was slender and graceful, and I could pour a good wine. And part of that was having the children of a powerful man. And I used to say that I wanted, when asked, the aunts would say, well, what kind of man do you want? I had wonderful aunts. They were so wonderful. And girl cousins, wonderful girl cousins. But they would ask us, they taught us how to use how to use tampons, for God. It was a little female culture. What kind of men do we want to marry? And I would always say, well, I want to marry a professor or a writer or a scholar. Laura, it never entered my mind that I could be a professor or be a writer or be a scholar. My ambition was huge, but it was shaped by my culture. And I didn't resist.
When did you realize you could be those things yourself?
Yesterday. 5 minutes ago, when you asked me to count. No, that's not candid. But I also understood, as a young woman, moving up with these, part of my, the octopus arms, part of myself in tow, my 2 children. I also realized that I would have to choose my battles. And so I became compliant and charming. And they left me alone to do my work. And that's what I thought. That's what I felt. I didn't think that. But then I came across the work of Audre Lorde. She was another influence that changed my life. Her work and women of kitchen table women of color press. I was seeing at Prairie Schooner, I was seeing their books come out, and I began to understand. I began to understand the correlation between fear and achievement. And there's that great Georgia O'Keeffe, I know you know it, Georgia O'Keeffe quote, all my life I've been afraid of my life, and let it keep me from doing one thing I wanted to do. So negating fear, learning to live with that and move forward. I mean, Martin Luther. We know that our great heroes who did that, and I learned to do that. But I also learned that it didn't hurt if I had the support of the dean. And so I served on the dean's executive committee for a number of years. So to help women writers be seen as the equivalent of male scholars in the academy, and to speak as eloquently as I could for each individual. And each one that was never the problem. Achievement was not the problem. It was the perception or the valuing of achievement. So I did a lot of these things, and I took to the street less and less as I grew more and more powerful.
Yeah. Do you think power, as separate from a man's power, is something that that you discovered through getting older, or was it life experience, or both, or what was it?
It was both, and it was also a refusal to turn away from what was true. And so here I was, the editor of Prairie Schooner, and I hadn't a clue. There was a huge debt. I had no idea how to do this. I didn't know how, but I said yes and yes and yes, and I was publishing. I like to publish. I mean, who doesn't? You know, so then I had this, and how did I learn to do it? Well, I called Stanley Lindbergh, you know, he's editing, was it Georgia Review then? I don't know, there were two, and I had George Core, two major male editors, and I would call them, and I had never met them in person, but they knew who I was, and I knew who they were, and we had been on panels together, you know, at different times at the same meetings. I would go to these meetings, I give the keynote, they give whatever. The magazine culture was an important one because that's how you moved ahead. And I would say, I have the university requires, I have 3 bids for printing. I have no idea how to read them or what should I do? And so George would say, well, read me, and then he would tell me how to choose. And or Stanley I would say, Stanley, I just got this call, and I don't know exactly the tactful way to deal with it. And he would say, well, you know, here's what I do. And this went on for months, years, until I learned how to do it, how to retire the debt. I had no idea. These were male mentors. I didn't ask them to understand that I was trying to hear women's voices. They would have said, I'm listening. They were, but they just, so.
Yeah.
You do what you do what you have to do. That's a history of progress. You do what you have to do.
Yeah. And, you know, I think just personally, it resonates with me that often as women who are owning our power, it feels as though we need to be authorities. And if we ask for help, that's a weakness. So I'm often afraid to admit that I don't know how to do something or how to ask for help. And it has been very important to me to find mentors, and I've been lucky enough to find a few, just like you mentioned, to call and say, you know, I'm going to be very transparent with you and very open. I don't know what I'm doing in this case. Can you advise me? And I think that's part of being empowered, is to admit that you're not an authority and that you don't have the answers, and to ask for help. So that's a really helpful thing to hear, Hilda.
Absolutely. Erin wrote, and I don't even think I can find it. Let me read. In writing this book have not been those who offered neatly bounded abstract explanations, regardless of intellectual discipline or radical conservative flavor. The real experts were messily making a fuss, performing pages and in the street, wearing clown noses, masking the arts of illness, exploring the body's limits, dancing in wheelchairs, representing themselves in multiple colors, cultures, and tongues. This book represents a fragment of that work, a 40-year collaboration between the authors in the fine art of making a fuss, or paraphrasing Emile Zola, living out loud. And that's the authority that Erin claimed for this book. We lived it. And that's the authority that we have when we come to Writer Mother Monster and speak candid about our ambition and our successes, to collaborate our power. And I'm very aware of the fact that collaboration is what some Jews did with Germans, and some. Collaboration is a very mixed word, but we are most powerful when we admit we need a teacher and we look to others very different from us for insight and lessons. I mean, we weren't born knowing how to sew in a zipper. I mean, I don't know how to sew in a zipper, but I would ask someone.
Absolutely. I don't either. But like you said, we can ask. And we're not born knowing how to be mothers or writers either. So, yeah. Thank you, Hilda, for joining us. And thank you for this conversation. It's just been such a pleasure. And I'm going to hold up your book again here for people who have not yet read Hilda, or if you don't own this book, please go out and get it.
And this
thank
one
you
too.
so much.
And this one too.
Yes, that one too.
What becomes you?
All the books.
Thanks
Thank you so much, Hilda. I hope you'll come back again sometime soon and join us again.
I'd love to. I'd love to. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Be well.
And thank you all for joining us, as always. It's been such a fun conversation. And if you enjoyed it as much as I do, please consider becoming a patron or patroness of Writer Mother Monster. You can find information on writermothermonster.com. And I'll see you all next week. Thank you.